During the drought, a boy gave his last drop of water to a rival's horse and was called before the village council. The wooden gavel struck 3 times against the weathered oak table, each impact echoing through the cramped town hall like gunshots in the desert silence. Martha Henderson sat rigid in her chair, her calloused hands gripping the armrests as she watched her 18-year-old son Tommy fidget beside her. The boy's sun-bleached hair stuck to his forehead with nervous sweat, and his blue eyes darted between the 5 stern faces of the Dustridge Village Council. Outside, the relentless Arizona sun beat down on cracked earth that hadn't seen rain in 4 months. The drought of 1893 had turned the once thriving cattle town into a graveyard of dreams, where every drop of water was more precious than gold, and neighbors eyed each other with a suspicion of starving wolves. Council Chairman Edgar Whitmore adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and cleared his throat. The man's gaunt frame seemed to have shrunk even more since the drought began, his black suit hanging loose on his shoulders like funeral drapes. Behind him, a hand-painted sign read, "Water rationing strictly enforced. Violators face banishment." Martha's weathered face remained stoic, but her heart hammered against her ribs. She had raised Tommy alone after his father died in a mining accident 7 years ago, working as the town seamstress and taking in laundry to make ends meet. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every calloused finger from needle pricks had been for this boy. Now, at 40 years old, she felt every line on her face deepen as she watched her son's future hang in the balance. The charges were serious. In a town where water theft meant death sentences and families turned against each other for a single bucket from the well, Tommy Henderson stood accused of giving away their family's precious water ration to the horse of their biggest rival, Jake Morrison, the man who had been systematically buying up failing ranches for pennies on the dollar. Whitmore shuffled through his papers with deliberate slowness, savoring the dramatic tension. The council chamber, usually used for mundane town business, now felt like a courtroom where verdicts meant life or death. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating particles that danced in the stifling air like tiny spirits bearing witness to the proceedings. Tommy shifted in his chair, the wooden legs creaking against the floorboards. His hands, still soft despite months of manual labor helping his mother, trembled slightly. At 18, he possessed the gangly awkwardness of youth, all elbows and knees, but his eyes held an intensity that spoke of someone forced to grow up too quickly. The drought had changed everything in Dustridge. What began as a prosperous cattle town nestled in a valley between red mesa formations had devolved into a desperate community, where moral boundaries blurred like heat mirages on the horizon. Wells that had flowed freely for decades now produced barely enough water to sustain human life, let alone livestock. Martha remembered better times when the Henderson family owned a small but thriving ranch on the outskirts of town. Her late husband Daniel had built their modest 2-room house with his own hands, complete with a front porch where she would sit evenings mending clothes while Tommy played with wooden horses carved by his father's skilled hands. The adjacent barn housed their 3 horses and handful of cattle, and a vegetable garden flourished behind the house. But drought was a merciless destroyer of dreams. First, the cattle died one by one, their carcasses picked clean by buzzards under the scorching sun. Then the horses, except for Buttercup, Tommy's beloved Mare that Daniel had given him for his 10th birthday. Finally, they lost the ranch itself to Jake Morrison when they couldn't pay the mortgage, moving into town to rent a single room above the general store. Morrison had circled their property like a vulture, making increasingly aggressive offers as their situation deteriorated. The man owned half the surviving businesses in town and showed no mercy to families facing hardship. His cold gray eyes and perpetual sneer had earned him enemies throughout Dustridge, but his wealth provided protection that ordinary folks lacked. Now, as Martha watched her son face the council's judgment, she reflected on the cruel irony that Morrison's actions had led to this moment. The man who had destroyed their livelihood was the same person whose horse had received Tommy's compassion, the final act that brought them before this tribunal. Whitmore finally looked up from his papers, his pale eyes fixing on Tommy with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the soft whisper of wind through the building's weathered boards and the distant lowing of Morrison's remaining cattle in their heavily guarded pens. The council members represented what remained of Dustridge's leadership, hardened men who had survived frontier hardships through pragmatism and sometimes ruthless decision-making. Besides Whitmore, there was Samuel Brooks, the bank president whose own vault had been emptied to buy water from traveling merchants. Dr. Marcus Webb, the town physician who had watched patients die from dehydration while strictly rationing his own medical supplies. Reverend Isaiah Porter, whose sermons had grown increasingly desperate as he struggled to maintain faith in the face of divine abandonment. And Henry Caldwell, the blacksmith whose forge rarely burned now that there were no horses left to shoe. Each man bore the physical and emotional scars of the drought. Brooks had lost 30 pounds, his expensive suits now hanging like sacks on his diminished frame. Webb's medical bag contained more prayer than medicine, as conventional treatments proved useless against the slow death of dehydration. Porter's once robust voice had been reduced to a raspy whisper from preaching in the dust-filled church where attendance dwindled weekly as families fled town or succumbed to despair. Caldwell's powerful arms, built from decades of swinging heavy hammers, had grown thin from malnutrition and lack of work. Tommy's alleged crime had occurred 3 days earlier at Morrison's ranch, where the boy had been seeking work to help support his mother. The details, as reported by Morrison himself, painted a picture of inexplicable generosity in a time when such actions bordered on insanity. According to Morrison's testimony, he had caught Tommy near the horse corral giving water from his personal canteen to Midnight, Morrison's prized black stallion. The horse had been suffering in the heat, its breathing labored and foam gathering around its muzzle. In a town where a single cup of water represented survival for another day, Tommy's action constituted not just theft, but an act of treason against his own family's welfare. Martha knew her son's character better than anyone. Tommy possessed an innate kindness that the harsh realities of frontier life had been unable to crush. Even as a child, he would share his meager portions with stray dogs and injured birds, much to her simultaneous pride and exasperation. His father's death had forced him to mature quickly, but it hadn't hardened his heart the way it might have another boy. The seamstress work that sustained them required Martha to interact with most families in Dustridge, mending clothes and creating new garments from whatever fabric could be obtained. Through these interactions, she had witnessed the drought's psychological toll on the community. Neighbors who had once shared meals and celebrated holidays together now watched each other with suspicion and resentment. Children played fewer games and laughed less frequently. Adults spoke in hushed tones about rationing and survival strategies. The weekly church services that had once brought the community together now felt like funeral vigils for a dying town. Even the saloon, traditionally the heart of social interaction, stood mostly empty as men lacked both money and spirit for drinking. Morrison's increasing influence during this crisis had not gone unnoticed. While other families lost everything, he somehow maintained adequate water supplies for his remaining livestock and continued expanding his property holdings. Rumors circulated about secret wells and underground water sources, but no one dared challenge him directly given his political connections and remaining wealth. The man had even approached Martha twice with what he called generous offers for her services. The first involved moving to his ranch as a live-in seamstress, which she politely declined despite their desperate circumstances. The second, made just weeks before Tommy's incident, was more direct. He would provide water and protection for her family in exchange for unspecified companionship during the difficult times ahead. Martha's rejection of Morrison's advances had been swift and definitive, despite knowing it might have consequences for her and Tommy's survival. She had not shared these encounters with her son, recognizing that his protective instincts might lead him to make rash decisions that could endanger them both. Now, as Whitmore prepared to read the formal charges, Martha wondered if Morrison's testimony about the water incident was entirely truthful. The man's vindictive nature and history of manipulation made her question whether Tommy's act of kindness had been deliberately orchestrated or exaggerated to serve Morrison's revenge. Whitmore's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade through silk. The charges were read with ceremonial gravity, each word emphasizing the severity of Tommy's alleged actions in the context of community survival. Water theft, violation of rationing laws, and endangering family welfare through reckless compassion. Crimes that would have seemed absurd in better times, but carried deadly serious implications in their current circumstances. Tommy's response would determine not just his own fate, but potentially his mother's survival as well. Banishment from Dustridge meant certain death in the desert, while remaining might subject them to community ostracism and complete isolation from the meager resources that kept other families alive. The boy finally stood to address the council, his lanky frame casting a long shadow across the dusty floorboards. His voice, when it came, carried the clear tones of youth, but with an underlying strength that reminded Martha painfully of his father. What Tommy said next would either save them both or condemn them to a fate worse than the drought itself. The words that emerged from her son's lips were not what Martha expected, nor what the council anticipated. Instead of denial or justification, Tommy Henderson began to tell a story that would reveal the true nature of compassion, sacrifice, and the complicated relationship between survival and humanity in the face of nature's most unforgiving test. His tale would force every person in that stifling room to confront their own moral compromises and question whether preserving life meant abandoning the very qualities that made life worth preserving. The drought had taken their water, their livestock, and their prosperity. But Tommy's actions raised a more fundamental question. In their desperate fight for survival, what had they allowed it to take from their souls? Tommy cleared his throat, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as he surveyed the 5 weathered faces before him. The council chamber felt smaller with each passing second, the walls seeming to close in like the sides of a coffin. Outside, a dust devil swirled across the main street, picking up debris and scattering it against storefronts in a rhythmic tattoo that matched his heartbeat. "Councilman," Tommy began, his voice steadier than Martha had expected, "I reckon you all know me as Daniel Henderson's boy. My pay always taught me that a man's character ain't measured by what he does when folks are watching, but by what he does when nobody's around to see." Whitmore leaned forward, his spectacles reflecting the harsh sunlight streaming through the windows. The chairman's patience was wearing thin, evident in the way his fingers drummed against the oak table. Behind him, the other council members maintained their stoic expressions, but Martha could read the subtle signs of men pushed beyond their limits, the tight lines around Dr. Webb's eyes, the slight tremor in Reverend Porter's hands, the way Blacksmith Caldwell's jaw muscles flexed with suppressed emotion. "Get to the point, boy," Whitmore snapped. "We ain't got time for philosophy lessons. Did you or did you not give away your family's water ration to Morrison's horse?" Tommy's gaze never wavered, though Martha noticed his hands clench into fists at his sides. The boy had inherited his father's stubborn streak, a trait that had served Daniel well in life but had also contributed to his death when he refused to abandon a collapsed mine shaft that claimed 3 other men. "Yes, sir, I did give water to that horse," Tommy replied simply. "But there's more to it than what Morrison told you." A collective intake of breath filled the chamber. Martha felt her heart sink into her stomach like a stone dropped into a deep well. She had hoped against hope that the charges were false, that some misunderstanding had led to this nightmare. Now her son's admission sealed their fate with the certainty of a nail hammered into a coffin lid. Banker Brooks shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the leather creaking under his reduced weight. The man who had once commanded respect through his financial acumen now looked like a scarecrow dressed in expensive clothes. His investment in various town enterprises had crumbled along with the drought-stricken economy, leaving him nearly as desperate as the families he had once denied loans. "The more to it don't matter," Brooks interjected, his voice carrying the bitter edge of a man who had watched his life's work evaporate like morning dew in the desert heat. "Water's water, and every drop counts. Your family's been allocated the same ration as everyone else, and you had no right to give it away." "Doctor," Webb raised a trembling hand, his medical training compelling him to seek understanding even in the face of seemingly indefensible actions. The physician had lost more patients to dehydration in the past 4 months than he had to all other causes combined in his previous 20 years of practice. Each death weighed heavily on his conscience, knowing that a few extra cups of water might have saved lives. "Let the boy finish," Webb said quietly. "In my experience, actions that seem senseless often have deeper motivations. I've seen men do inexplicable things when pushed to their limits." Tommy nodded gratefully toward the doctor, then continued his testimony with growing confidence. The morning sun had shifted position, casting different shadows across the chamber floor and highlighting the dust motes that swirled in the air like microscopic dancers performing their own desperate ballet. 3 days ago, I went to Morrison's ranch looking for work, Tommy explained. "My ma's been taking in extra mending, but it ain't enough to keep us going much longer. I figured maybe Morrison would pay fair wages for honest work, even if he ain't exactly known for his generosity." Martha knew the truth behind Tommy's job search. They had been down to their last few dollars, and the boy had been skipping meals to ensure she had enough to eat. She had tried to hide their desperate circumstances from him, but teenage boys were more observant than adults often credited them with being. The Henderson family's financial situation had deteriorated rapidly after losing their ranch. Martha's seamstress work provided barely enough income to pay their room rent above the general store, and the drought had reduced demand even for essential services like clothing repair. Many families were making do with increasingly threadbare garments rather than spending precious money on alterations. Tommy's voice grew stronger as he continued his account. "When I got to Morrison's place, I found him in his house counting money. Stacks of bills spread across his dining table like he was playing some kind of card game. He was wearing clean clothes and looked well fed, which struck me as odd considering how the rest of us have been getting by." The council members exchanged glances, each man silently acknowledging what they all suspected but had been afraid to voice openly. Morrison's continued prosperity during the community's darkest hour had raised questions that no one dared ask directly. The man's political connections and remaining wealth made him effectively untouchable, even by the village council. "Morrison barely looked up when I knocked," Tommy continued. "Just waved me toward the corral and said he'd pay 50 cents if I could get his horses watered and fed before noon. 50 cents might not sound like much to some folks, but it meant the difference between my ma eating supper or going hungry another night." Martha's eyes filled with tears at her son's words, though she fought to maintain her composure in the formal setting. The boy's protective instincts toward her had been evident since his father's death, but hearing him articulate his motivation so clearly drove home how much responsibility he had shouldered at such a young age. The corral Tommy described was a scene from a nightmare. Morrison's remaining horses stood in whatever shade they could find, their ribs visible through patchy coats and their eyes dull with dehydration. The water troughs, designed to serve a dozen animals, contained barely enough liquid to cover the bottom with a thin layer of brackish moisture. "That's when I saw Midnight," Tommy said, his voice taking on a different quality, softer, more emotional. Morrison's prize stallion was standing apart from the other horses, and I could tell he was in bad shape. Real bad shape. Midnight had been the pride of Morrison's stable before the drought, a magnificent black stallion with Arabian bloodlines that had cost more money than most families in Dustridge saw in a year. The horse had won racing competitions throughout the territory and had been Morrison's most visible symbol of wealth and status. Tommy's description of the stallion's condition painted a heartbreaking picture. The once proud animal stood with his head hanging low, sides heaving with labored breathing, foam gathered around his muzzle where flies buzzed in lazy circles. His coat, formerly glossy as polished obsidian, had become dull and patchy, while his eyes held the resigned look of a creature that had given up hope. "I started filling the water troughs from the well," Tommy continued, "but the pump was barely working. Takes maybe 10 minutes of hard cranking just to get a bucket's worth, and the water that comes up is brown and tastes like mud. Still, it was water, and those horses needed every drop they could get." The boy's narrative transported his listeners to that sun-baked corral, where the temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees despite the early hour. The metal pump handle burned his hands even through work gloves, and sweat poured down his face as he labored to bring up water from the increasingly shallow well. Morrison had remained inside his house during this time, apparently unconcerned with his animal's welfare as long as someone else was doing the work. Through the kitchen window, Tommy could see the man still seated at his table, methodically sorting currency with the mechanical precision of a bank teller. The contrast between Morrison's comfortable circumstances and his horses' suffering struck the boy as fundamentally wrong. "After about an hour, I managed to get maybe 3 inches of water in each trough," Tommy said. "The other horses rushed over and started drinking, but Midnight just stood there. He was too weak to push through the crowd, and by the time the others finished, there wasn't much left." Martha could picture the scene clearly, her compassionate son watching helplessly as the weakest animal was denied access to the life-giving water he had worked so hard to provide. Tommy had always possessed an instinctive sympathy for creatures that couldn't defend themselves, a trait that had occasionally gotten him into trouble but had never wavered despite the harsh realities of frontier life. The stallion's plight represented something larger than one horse's suffering. In Midnight's failing strength and diminished status, Tommy had recognized a reflection of their entire community's decline. The powerful had become weak, the proud had been humbled, and survival had become a daily struggle that stripped away dignity along with hope. "That's when I made my decision," Tommy said, his voice growing quiet but resolute. "I pulled out my canteen, the one my pa gave me before he died, and I walked over to Midnight. The horse was barely standing, and I could see he didn't have much time left." The canteen Tommy referenced was indeed a treasured possession, one of the few tangible connections he maintained to his father's memory. Daniel Henderson had carried it during his years as a cowboy before settling down to ranch life, and the dented metal surface bore scratches and dings that told stories of long cattle drives and frontier adventures. Martha remembered the day Daniel had presented the canteen to their 10-year-old son, ceremoniously passing down what he called a cowboy's most important tool. The gesture had been part of a larger conversation about responsibility and the sacred nature of water in desert country. Never had any of them imagined that lesson would be tested under such extreme circumstances. "I held that canteen up to Midnight's muzzle," Tommy continued, "and he drank every drop. Maybe it wasn't much, probably no more than a cup's worth, but you could see it made a difference. His breathing got easier, and he lifted his head a little higher. For just a moment, he looked like the magnificent horse I remembered from better times." The silence that followed Tommy's words was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the building's weathered boards and the distant sound of sand hitting glass. Each council member processed the boy's testimony through the lens of their own moral struggles, weighing compassion against survival, individual conscience against community welfare. Reverend Porter was the first to break the silence, his raspy voice carrying the weight of a man who had wrestled with faith during the darkest of times. The preacher's sermons had grown increasingly desperate as he watched his congregation dwindle, not through loss of faith, but through loss of life itself. Families had fled Dustridge in search of water and opportunity, leaving behind empty pews and abandoned dreams. "Son," Porter said slowly, "what you describe sounds like Christian charity, but charity becomes suicide when resources are this scarce. Every drop of water you gave to that horse was a drop taken from your family's survival." Tommy turned to face the Reverend directly, his young features set with determination that reminded Martha painfully of his father during moments of moral conviction. Daniel Henderson had possessed the same ability to remain calm while defending principles that others found inconvenient or dangerous. "Reverend," Tommy replied respectfully, "you've preached plenty of sermons about loving thy neighbor and showing mercy to those who can't help themselves. Does that only apply when it's easy? When we've got plenty to spare?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, challenging not just Porter, but every man in the room to examine the gap between their stated beliefs and their survival instincts. The drought had tested more than their physical endurance. It had revealed the true nature of their characters when stripped of comfort and security. "Doctor?" Webb leaned forward, his medical mind seeking to understand the practical implications of Tommy's choice. The physician had been forced to make countless difficult decisions about resource allocation, choosing which patients received precious medicines and which were left to rely on prayer and hope. "Tommy," Webb said gently, "I understand your motivation, but you must realize that every person in this town is fighting for survival. Your mother depends on you to make rational decisions that keep both of you alive. How do you justify risking her life for the sake of an animal?" The question struck at the heart of Tommy's internal struggle. Martha could see the pain in her son's eyes as he grappled with the fundamental conflict between immediate compassion and long-term responsibility. It was a dilemma that had no easy answers, especially for someone barely out of childhood who's being forced to make adult decisions with life or death consequences. "Doctor," Tommy said after a long pause, "my pa used to say that once you start deciding who deserves to live and who deserves to die, you've crossed a line that changes who you are forever. Maybe that horse was just an animal to most folks, but to me, he represented something important." The boy's words carried an emotional weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the chamber. Outside, the relentless sun continued its assault on the drought-stricken landscape, while inside, 5 men and 1 desperate mother confronted questions that went far beyond simple rule-breaking or resource management. Tommy's testimony was building toward its crucial revelation, the moment when the full truth of his actions would be revealed. Martha sensed that her son's story contained layers of meaning that had not yet been exposed, complexities that might change how the council viewed both his decision and Morrison's role in recent events. The ominous silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, each person lost in their own thoughts about survival, morality, and the price of remaining human in the face of nature's cruelest test. What Tommy would reveal next would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the moral direction of their entire community. The boy took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and prepared to deliver the truth that would either save them or damn them all.